Great. Who would have known there'd be so many people so excited about Energy Utilities Board? It just shows you the enthusiasm we have here in New Brunswick. I think it's fantastic. Okay, I've got it. All right, well, there will be some beeping that goes on for a moment while Corey's letting folks in. Let me say welcome and thank you for joining us today. This is a session about the Energy Utilities Board and how it works in the province and how it affects our daily lives. And I know I've always wondered how it all works and how I might participate more, and I clearly think others do too, which is why so many of you are joining today. The presentation will be recorded, so if you obviously want to share it, we always put it up on our YouTube channel. And I'm Louise Comeau. I direct the Climate Change and Energy Program at the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, and do all things energy, but have a particular passion about electricity issues. Which leads me to just note that this session will feature presentations from the public intervener and EUB staff. I will read some bios here in a moment, but I did want to say that just coincidentally to our session being scheduled, and I'm grateful for the request of Jim Emberger at one of our most recent meetings. He said, you know, it'd be great if we got a briefing on how the EUB works. And so here we are today. But just last week, the government also introduced some amendments to the Electricity Act, which is not going to be the focus of today's conversation. That is government legislative change, but we are working on getting a technical briefing on what those changes are and how they might affect electricity and NB power and so on in the province. It's such an important area. So just to let you know that that is in the works. We're working hard to see if government would schedule a technical briefing. I'm also going to try something I haven't done before. I'm going to try and do a couple of polls, just a quick one question poll at the beginning and at the end of the webinar, so that we can learn about whether or not we are helping people reach their own goals for their own work and interests when we do our webinars. And we have presentations that will not be as long as our full hour, leaving us a good amount of time for questions. And as you can see, this webinar is in English, but we're very fortunate that Kathleen Mitchell also speaks French. And so if you have questions you want to ask in French, please do so, particularly to Kathleen. And then as we're going through the presentations, please put your questions in the chat. When we open it up, I'll be working to try to moderate those questions in the chat. And if you want to unmute and ask a question so that we can hear you, obviously you're welcome to do that. But the chat is always there if there are any questions. Okay, let me start by doing my first attempt at a poll. I'm going to launch it now, and folks should be able to see the poll. Can they see it now?
Yeah.
All right, go for it. Answer the question. I joined today's webinar to learn more about, and you may select more than one option if you like. Well, this is very cool. I can see it all coming in. Super. We'll just give that another second. We've got just a couple of more people to complete their answers. Fantastic. So let me just, if somebody's just coming in and can see that we're doing a poll, if you want to quickly answer that, but I'll just give folks a sense of these responses. So the options were, we want to know more about how the EUB makes decisions. the barriers the EUB faces in considering social and environmental issues, how the EUB defines reasonable rates, how the EUB defines the public interest, and all of the above. Most of you, 57% say all of the above, and 43% say how the EUB makes decisions, 30% what barriers there might be, 10% how just and reasonable rates are defined, and 33% how the EUB defines the public interest. That is fantastic. Thank you so much for giving us that feedback. And then we'll ask at the end whether or not you feel you got the information you wanted on those topics. All right, let me quickly introduce what we're doing here today and then hand it over to our speakers. The EUB does regulate electricity and natural gas utilities as well as motor carriers. And they have a mandate to ensure that customers like ourselves will receive safe and reliable service at just and reasonable rates. So you see why I included that in the poll. The board sets weekly retail prices for petroleum products sold in the province. And we're hoping that the webinar helps us understand how the EUB's work affects the work that each of us do. Many of us involved in climate change work and in social justice work and in energy work. I'm going to introduce Kathleen Mitchell first from the EUB. She's been with the board for 7 years, and she is the chief clerk. She manages the regulatory filings, distributing board communications to the public, and plays an important role in the development and implementation of the board's rules of procedure. Kathleen holds an MBA with specialization in data analytics. Dave Young works with Kathleen. He will be here as part of the discussion and conversation. He's the manager of regulatory services, responsible for ensuring board members have the evidence they need to arrive at a decision. As a consequence, he directs the review of evidence for hearings as well as energy market monitoring and analysis done by board staff. Dave is a former reporter, which I find super interesting, and he joined the board in 2006 as a regulatory advisor. He has degrees in economics as well as biology and journalism. Heather Black is New Brunswick's public intervener, a role I'm fascinated by. I just find it so interesting. And it's focused on advocating on behalf of the public interest in matters before the Energy and Utilities Board. Heather obtained her Bachelor of Business Administration and Bachelor of Laws from UNB. Oh, Roy, you're
okay, Mary. I'm in the middle of a Zoom right now.
Can we put Roy on mute, please? Thank you. Heather's been in her current role as public intervener for the past 7 years, having spent 13 years in private practice. She's also a director and trustee of the New Brunswick Law Foundation and a volunteer with the Law Society of New Brunswick annual bar admission course. So very accomplished people. We're very fortunate to have them with us. Why don't I pass it now to you, Kathleen, to share your screen and do your presentation.
Great, thank you so much, and I appreciate the opportunity to share today what the board does and help people understand a little better who the board is and what we do. So I will share this. Bear with me while I get this going. Go. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my presentation. So I'll start today just with a little brief introduction about who we are. The New Brunswick Energy and Utilities Board is a quasi-judicial tribunal. We were established by the legislature to regulate electricity, natural gas, motor carrier, pipeline, and set maximum gasoline prices in the province as well. The board is made up of a chair, a vice chair, and 3 board members. Although our chairperson retired from the board in January 2020, so our current acting chair is François Beaulieu, who held the position of vice chair previous to his acting role. We've also had a recent retirement of a board member, so at this time we have an acting chairperson and 2 board members. The board also has a staff of 20 as well, including advisors to the board. That includes the board members as well, administration employees, pipeline safety inspectors, and electricity compliance staff. The board's offices are located in St. John on the 14th floor of 15 Market Square, which is City Hall in the city of St. John. And the board's compliance staff are located in Fredericton. Let me see if I can flip. There we go. Okay. So the board was actually established in 1910 as the Board of Commissioners of Public Utilities. We are actually celebrating 110 years of regulation in the province. And the board actually has historically regulated phones, street railways, insurance, payday loans, water, trucking, electricity, natural gas, petroleum, pipeline, motor carriers as some sectors as examples. Now the board regulates areas such as electricity, natural gas, petroleum products pricing, pipeline, and motor carriers. The board operates under the Energy and Utilities Board Act, the Electricity Act, Gas Distribution Act, Pipeline Act, Motor Carrier Act, Petroleum Products Pricing Act, and the associated regulations. For the purposes of this presentation today, I'm going to look specifically at the electricity sector. And in that vein, as an example, I will use the Electricity Act in relation to electricity rate applications.
Kathleen,
yes.
Do you mind if I just jump in? We actually can't see the presentation. I think it's because you're not in slideshow mode. So if you maybe just click on slideshow at the top.
Sure.
There you are, I think, if you just do that.
Let me see.
Sorry to do that to you.
Oh, no problem. Let's see, I'll try this again.
So what we get here is just...
Maybe try going to the slideshow tab, Kathleen.
At the top, that's it. There's the spot right there. Just click on it. Yeah, well, you could go, from there. Yep.
I'm not, can you see that now?
We just have your cover slide.
Okay.
So if you click on from the beginning, it should open to...
Yeah, it's opening a separate window.
What that means is you're going to need to open up the presentation before you share your screen. And then on that share screen option, you get to choose which window you're sharing. So that might be the issue.
Once I hit presentation, I can't access Zoom anymore. It's in behind my presentation.
Okay, so don't worry about it. Just you keep talking and don't stress out about it at all.
When you first opened the presentation, I did notice there was a little tab at the top that said display settings, and I think you can change that to show only the slideshow, but I can't recall under what tab that is. But like Louise says, I think we'll be good either way.
Okay.
Don't worry about it. And we'll be sharing presentation after, so don't worry about it. Yeah, I'd rather not stress you out.
Sure. Okay. Okay. So I guess sorry about that you can't see my presentation. Hopefully my description is enough to help people, but thank you for making the presentation available to everybody afterwards. Okay, so as I mentioned, for the purposes of this presentation, I'll look specifically at rate applications in the electricity sector. But the board may also receive applications in the electricity sector that are not rate applications. Just as an example, a capital project or approval of reliability standards. And then, of course, in other sectors, we may receive applications there as well. Other types of application outside of rate applications may follow a similar process, but just for the purposes of today's presentation, as an example, I will talk about rate applications. So when an application is received by the board for rates, the application is posted on the board's website. So the board's website is www.nbeub.ca, or in French, it's www.cespnb.ca, and the application is available there. When you're on our website, there is a section called What's New, where we post notices about hearings or applications that have been filed. But there's also a section called Hearings and Decisions. And in the Hearings and Decisions section of the website, people can look at matters that are open before the board, or they can look at a specific application that they may be interested in. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. In addition to publishing on our website, a notice of the application is posted in the on our Twitter page. We do have Twitter, and we also publish in the daily newspapers in the province. The notice of application invites interested parties to request intervener status if they would like to. And we give some instructions within the notice about how you can request intervener status, and I'll talk a little more about that as well. The notice of application sets out the deadline to submit your intervener request, as well as establishing a pre-hearing date. And I will talk a little more about a pre-hearing in a moment as well. There's often also a draft schedule that is developed by the board. So it's a draft filing and hearing schedule. And we circulate that to parties prior to the pre-hearing conference so that there can be a discussion about how the proceeding goes ahead once we get started. The schedule culminates in a hearing at the end of the process. So I did have in my slides a picture of what a filing schedule looks like, but each of our matters will also have an example on our website of a filing schedule. But generally, it begins with the pre-hearing, and the pre-hearing is to discuss preliminary issues and establish a filing schedule. The filing schedule sets out a number of different deadlines that will be in place throughout the hearing process. So as some examples of those, we have interrogatories. So interrogatories are written questions that are filed to anyone who provides evidence. So there is an opportunity to file interrogatories to the applicant. And then once interveners file evidence, people can also file interrogatories to interveners on their evidence. So when people request to intervene during the pre-hearing, those intervener requests are considered. Anyone that is granted intervener status can file evidence and interrogatories as we go through the process. There are also dates set for notices of motion, so people can file motions on or prior to those dates, and motion hearing days if we were to receive a motion. So some examples of motion that we can receive can have to do with when people receive responses to interrogatories. If a question wasn't answered, as an example, they can file a motion with the board. So there's generally a hearing date set to hear those motions, and those proceedings are part of the hearing schedule. Ultimately, once we go through all of the interrogatories, the filing of evidence, the motion hearings, this all culminates in a final hearing. So the final hearing is where we mark the evidence, we listen to opening statements, there is an opportunity for cross-examination, and each of the parties can also do a closing argument. As part of the hearing, sometimes there are expert witnesses involved in these proceedings. These are consultants that are hired by various parties to present some of their evidence. There is an expert witness acknowledgement that is part of the board's rules of procedure that the witnesses have to sign, that acknowledges that they have been engaged to provide fair, objective, and nonpartisan evidence, and that it relates only to their areas of expertise. Those witnesses are involved in the hearing and are often cross-examined by those involved. As part of rate hearings, we also establish a public session or public submissions. For this process, we have a separate notice that is published on the board's website, on our Twitter page, and in newspapers. And we often send a press release as well, just to try to get this out as widely as possible. And these public sessions are an opportunity for those who perhaps have not requested to intervene but would like to provide some comment on the application, that they can do so. And I'll talk a little more about how you can do that a little later as well. There are occasions that there are parties that file information in confidence with the board. And when they do that, the parties have to file what is called a claim for confidentiality that outlines the reasons that the party is requesting that a document be held in confidence. And any party that wishes to object to a claim for confidentiality can do so, and the board can hear arguments on that issue. Sometimes when a claim for confidentiality is filed, parties may say they wish to hold the information in confidence, but will share it with people who sign a confidentiality undertaking as part of the process. When it comes to the different hearings and procedures that the board holds, when the pandemic hit, the board moved to doing proceedings online via the Zoom video conference platform. This allowed for the board to proceed with our hearings while ensuring that the public health guidelines were being followed at the same time. As with our in-person proceedings, these hearings are open to the public. We have also made a phone line available for those who prefer to listen over the phone rather than logging in through the internet. And while in future we may be able to hold in-person proceedings again, the board is also working to see that we can continue to offer a live stream or an internet portion so that people can continue to observe online without traveling to a physical location to observe a proceeding. So once a hearing is concluded, the board members then deliberate. They consider all of the evidence and arguments that have been put in front of it, all the submissions, and then that culminates in a decision. When a decision is issued, it is shared with all of the registered interveners and the applicant, of course, and it is published on the board's website for those who would like to read it. We also publish a notice that the decision is available on our Twitter page as well. During the hearing process as well, I should note that we have a court reporter that is present during these proceedings, so a transcript is produced during all of our hearings. So the transcripts are also published on our website so that they can be reviewed by anyone who's interested. After the fact, we're fortunate that we have a service that is able to provide us with the transcripts pretty quickly. So usually within a day or two of a proceeding is typically when we can have the transcript available for anyone who would like to read it. The board also developed what we call the board's rules of procedure. These were developed after consulting the rules that were in place in other jurisdictions for proceedings, as well as engaging with stakeholders to develop these rules. And these help provide some structure and guidance to to people that wish to participate in the board's proceedings, to give them basically a guideline or an idea of how they can participate and what's involved. So those rules are available on the board's website as well, and of course in both official languages for anyone to review at any time. For any projects that may be included in a rate application, the applicant must demonstrate that it is prudent and that there is a benefit to pursuing those projects. So as an example, we had an application at one point with NB Power where they applied for their rates, but also applied for advanced metering infrastructure. So sometimes there are projects that are included as part of their rate application. I mentioned that there are other ways to participate in a matter outside of intervening, and this is often where I get a lot of questions. So intervening in a matter, there's a whole schedule. There are opportunities to ask interrogatories, you can file your own evidence, etc. But for those who maybe don't want to get that involved in the process, there is another way to participate, and one of those ways is to file a letter of comment. This has become an area that we're seeing some more submissions, which is great. The board can accept letters of comment as submissions on the application. The letters become part of the public record, and as such are published on the board's website, as are all of the documents that are involved in a matter. So the board publishes not only the evidence, but we also publish letters that the board may issue with instructions to parties. They've published a filing schedule, and all of these letters of comment would be published on the board's website as well. When we have a public session, sometimes for those who maybe don't want to file a letter of comment, there's an opportunity to present their comments orally, so they can come and give an oral submission to the board as well on an application. As I mentioned before, any of the documents, including letters of comment, are available through going through the hearings and decisions section of our website. And that's where all of the materials can be viewed. I mentioned the rules of procedure, but we also have a number of guidelines that the board has developed to help people in their participation with the board. We have guidelines on sort of best practices when you're joining an online proceeding, which can be things like wearing a headset if you're going to be speaking, or just making sure that you're somewhere that has little distraction, those sorts of things. There's also guides on there on how to intervene and the board's processes. So those are all available on the board's website under the rules of procedure section. So we hope that those guides are helpful to people when they want to get involved with the board. But otherwise, we're also available to answer questions about procedures. So if someone thought that they might like to intervene, but they're not quite sure, I frequently get phone calls about that. So I can help people walk through the process so that they can determine for themselves if it's something they want to get into or not. So all of that to say, we are here to answer your questions, and I hope that was helpful.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. What I'll do is just pass it over to Heather now, and we can take questions at the end. And I apologize. I realize now, of course, I have your presentation. I could have advanced slides for you, but they really weren't needed. It was okay. It was great. Thank you so much. So Heather, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And I will try to share my screen, but I fully expect I'll run into the same trouble that Kathleen did. So let's see. Yeah, I think I'm going to run into the same. Oh, no, maybe it's good.
It's all good.
Can you see that advance? Okay, great. So hello, everybody. Before I get started, I'll just caution that my comments, I hope you do find them helpful, but they should not be considered to be advice of any kind, legal or otherwise. They're just my own observations and opinions as a perpetual intervener in front of the board. So I'll start by just talking about kind of an overlay over what Kathleen just talked about, but from the perspective of an intervener. And some of you have some experience in front of the board, and others are sort of considering whether it might be valuable to pursue your agendas in front of the board as an intervener. So as Kathleen said, the board's a quasi-judicial administrative tribunal. So its hearings are kind of like court proceedings in a lot of ways. So how is it like a court proceeding? Well, at the most basic level, its decisions are based on the evidence on the record in the proceeding. And with very limited exceptions, only the evidence on the record in the proceeding. So that's the whole reason why we need interveners. How does the board get an evidentiary record to base its decisions on? Well, unlike a court, where the general format is adversarial and adjudicative and resolves a discrete legal dispute between two parties who are sort of deeply involved or directly involved in it. The board hearings are different because they aren't typically disputes and they aren't typically between two adversarial parties. So the board's role is all about the public interest. So it needs ways to attract evidence that will facilitate its ability to make decisions in the public interest. And some of that evidence can come from the utility. It can come from board staff and their experts. It can come from the public intervener and my experts. But the board also counts on interveners advocating for their respective self-interests, if you're a customer of the utility, let's say, or like many of you, for the communities of public interest that they represent, to add different perspectives to the evidentiary record. The underlying principle is that interveners participate to be of service to the board. And it helps the board make accurate, legitimate, and acceptable decisions. So I'll just go through here. So the process works best when we're all, as interveners, when we're well informed and when we're responsibly engaged. So when I think about my own obligation to be well informed and responsibly engaged, I think that being well informed, it means that I try my very best to understand the specific matters and issue in the particular proceeding, whether that's a rate application like Kathleen reviewed or a different kind of application I have an interest in. It means reviewing and considering all the evidence from the utility and other interveners. And as Kathleen said, all that evidence is available to any intervener who participates, because it's all on the board's website unless there's particular confidential information. And it is detailed. I mean, I would encourage anybody who's thinking of intervening in a proceeding to just go through one of the past proceedings that are similar, a past MB Power rate application, a past MB Power capital project application, or a different one that you have an interest in, and just poke through the evidence and just see not only how voluminous, but how much detail is being offered to the public in general and to interveners in particular. A lot of people are quite surprised when they see the amount of material that's available. The other thing is important to learn the hearing process itself and the steps involved in participating and become familiar and comfortable with them. And as Kathleen mentioned, there are so many resources on the board's website. Kathleen and the folks at board staff are very, very helpful. And so that process, and the process is basically the same every time, and where it isn't, there's certainly guidance to get everyone through it. So even if you don't have regular experience in front of the board, there's lots of ways to become familiar with the process, and including not only the evidence from past proceedings, guides and materials for intervening, schedules and lists and that kind of thing, but also the full hearing transcripts from previous hearings, which may seem to be a little tedious to go through, but they can be very helpful to just get the sense of the flow and the back and forth in a hearing if you want to get a sense of it. So that's sort of how I try to make sure I'm informed when it comes to a new kind of proceeding that I haven't been exposed to before. The other thing that's important is to engage fully in the process. If you decide to be an intervener in all of the hearings in which I'm intervening, is to make sure that I'm responsibly engaged in the process. And what I think that means is thoughtfully participating in all of the hearing steps, testing the evidence that's available to me from the utility, from other interveners, submitting my own evidence. As Kathleen talked about, evidence is submitted to the board in writing through pre-filed testimony, supporting documents, either through experts or just yourself. The evidence, it's then tested and challenged, as Kathleen talked about, by other parties through interrogatories, which are written questions, so that we can, as interveners, we can test and challenge the evidence that the applicant has offered and dig into it further, ask further questions, and have them provide further information. And then when we file our own evidence, they can do the same with our evidence. And the point of all of that is to provide the board with robust, well-tested body of evidence so that the board can make a decision in the public interest. And that whole process culminates in this oral hearing where the parties who have submitted evidence and responded to these written interrogatories are required to testify under oath to the truth and accuracy of what we filed and the responses to the questions we've been asked. And witnesses are subject to cross-examination by the utility, by other interveners, by board staff, by the board panel themselves. So it is a very robust, fully tested process supported by a body of evidence that is testified to under oath. The other piece, I think, of responsible engagement for me means that the evidence I file, the challenges I put to the applicant's evidence or to the evidence of other interveners, and the arguments I make to the board should be relevant. Relevant meaning relevant to the matters at issue in the proceeding I'm in. They should be probative. So I tend to go through and say, okay, does this actually prove one of the relevant elements of my case that I'm trying to build? Or does it tend to disprove an element of a case of someone else that I'm trying to dismantle? Instead of going off in ways that may not be relevant to the proceeding. And the other thing that's important is because if you've ever been or observed one of these proceedings, you can see that with multiple parties, if one witness is being cross-examined or a set of questions are being asked to one witness, the board procedure is to go around the room to the applicant and every intervener to give them a chance to ask their questions, perform their own cross-examination. It's also important to listen and be non-duplicative. So because efficiency is very important, ratepayers pay for these proceedings. So it's really important to make sure not to duplicate the work someone else has done. If someone else has elicited an answer that supports your argument and it's the answer you wanted, you don't have to ask the question again. That can be very difficult in the middle of a proceeding. I find it difficult at times, but again, efficiency is important. These proceedings are expensive, they take a long time, and it's ratepayers who cover the cost of them. The other thing about responsible engagement, I think, is being respectful of the process and everyone participating in it, because folks who participate in it all the time, the board staff, the utilities, they're very respectful of the process and of the people who are engaged with them in it. So for me, what that means is obviously being respectful to the board, being respectful to its staff. It also means for me not demonizing the utilities or other regulated entities. It means being respectful to other submissions from other participants. It means sticking to the facts. It means building an argument that's supported by the evidence that's on the record. It means avoiding inflammatory language. It means avoiding hyperbolic language. And it just means generally being civilized to each other. So those are sort of my rules to live by when I'm engaging in a board proceeding. If any of you are thinking about becoming more engaged in board processes, but again, as Kathleen said, aren't quite in the position to want to fully intervene with all of those pieces that are involved in it. As Kathleen mentioned, there's often in board proceedings an alternative to full participation and full engagement, and that is to participate in what we call the public sessions, the letters of comment or the oral sessions, which is an opportunity offered to the general public. The important thing to understand is that none of that is evidence in the proceeding. You recall, if you've ever attended or participated in one of those sessions, you're not under oath when you provide your comments, but they are useful. They are useful to the board for in a couple of ways. They tend to happen quite soon before the oral hearing gets underway. And what that does is give those of us who are participating in the oral hearing some context, not only to understand and interpret the evidence that we have and will gain in the oral hearing, but also examples to put to witnesses, either the utilities witness or other interveners on cross-examination, or weave into our argument that adds some color and some context to the proceedings. So they're very valuable to the folks who are participating in the more formal process, even if they aren't technically, that information that you provide isn't technically evidence in the hearing. And of course, the same principles I think apply in terms of being well-informed, responsibly engaged, and you know, how valuable that service is to help the board. So here's a question: why do we need me if we have you? Why do we need a public intervener if we have other interveners? So part of this goes back to the question of what is the public interest? And spoiler is, there is no definition of the public interest, just like there's no definition of just reasonable rates. But the public interest changes with the context, it changes with the evidence, it changes with the circumstances, it changes with the time. And there are also multiple public interest objectives that conflict with each other or that rank differently in terms of priorities, depending on the situation we're in. And certain public interest objectives are more important to certain communities of interest than others are. So the way I think about why we need me if we have all kinds of other interveners, and in a perfect proceeding, we do have lots of interveners. But one thing that my role serves is to take the outcomes for which the applicant and the other interveners are advocating, which may be their own private interest, it may be collective interests of a particular group or constituency, or it might be another public focused interest, to take those stories, take those arguments and sort of hang them on a public interest framework by identifying how they align with and how they diverge from material public interest objectives that are of value to the board in the context of the particular matters that are an issue, and in the context of the board's mandate, and in the context of the evidence. And then consider any additional public interest values that the application touches, because not every interest and not every public interest objective can be represented by interveners. And then take that whole bundle, identify conflicts, identify priorities among them, and then construct an argument based on the evidence, the law, and longstanding regulatory principles that are meant to encourage the public interest to win out, as to how the board can achieve an outcome that's in the overall public interest. The second thing that the public intervener can do is test the case of the applicant with a dispassionate, reasonable eye, test generally for inaccuracies, inconsistencies, etc., and file evidence to demonstrate to the board what the results are, not only where the applicant may fall short or may be missing a piece or may have made an error, but where everything's fine, everything's reasonable. And other interveners may only focus on one piece of the applicant's evidence that is relevant to their particular concern or relevant to the case that they're building. So performing this function sort of more generally provides assistance to the board, and also doing it over and over and over with similar cases over time builds a body of knowledge within me and a sense of continuity over the issues at hand and how they develop all the time, which over time that can be valuable to the board as well. So how do we all know that the public intervener is advocating in the public interest? And what makes sure that I do that? Well, the short answer is that the position of public intervener is created by statute, which means I have very specific powers and very specific duties, and both of those have very specific limits. And the act that establishes my role, powers and duties of the public intervener is called an Act Respecting a Public Intervener for the Energy Sector. It's a New Brunswick statute. And the primary statutory obligation that I have is to intervene in all proceedings of the Energy and Utilities Board that are initiated in the energy sector. And those are matters that involve electricity. They might involve natural gas, petroleum pricing, or intra-provincial pipeline issues. I'm not free to choose to stay silent on those issues or in those proceedings or decline to participate in any of them. And the statute requires me, when intervening in those proceedings, to make representations in the public interest. And that means representations, it means making arguments and submissions on issues that come before the board. And since the public intervener is required by statute to be a lawyer, specifically a member of the Law Society of New Brunswick, that comes with its own rules for behavior and other rules for appearing in front of tribunals and other entities. And there are other obligations, but those are the big ones. Along with obligations come some related powers, and those powers are meant to ensure that my work is independent from the agenda of the government or of the board itself. So I'm obligated to intervene in every energy related proceeding of the board and make representations in the public interest, but the Act empowers me to determine for myself what arguments to pursue and how to support them with evidence. It's a very small sphere of power for someone to have. Admittedly, but that independence is meant to prevent the government or the board from using control over those decisions to influence my case in any way in favor of its own agenda. On the flip side, the Act sets really specific limitations on me in the form of some statutory prohibitions. And I want to highlight a couple because they're critical to the success of the public intervener model. And it's important, I think, if we're all going to be interveners together, it's important to understand them. The first one is that the Act says that the public intervener does not represent the interest of any customer or any customer class or any party to the proceeding, any government department or agency or other interested group. And people often assume that it's actually my job to represent the interests of certain groups of stakeholders, certain groups of customers, usually residential customers or other groups. And sometimes they get quite mystified or even indignant when they learn that not only is that not the case, but I'm actually statutorily prohibited from doing so. But that's really important to the success of the model because even within a specific group, a customer class or other group, all members of the group don't have the same interests. Whose interest should be represented or should be prioritized by the board? Residential customers? Which ones? The ones who use, in the case of electricity, the ones who use electricity for heating in winter, which costs the system more and is harder in the environment. The ones who don't use electricity for heat. Today's customer, tomorrow's customer, their short-term desires, their long-term needs. The customer who's interested in low rates today, the customer who's concerned about reliable supply, the customer who has an interest in getting incentives to generate their own power. Everybody's got different interests. It's very, very hard to create a homogeneous class to represent. So it wouldn't work even if we wanted to. And even if it was possible to identify a group or a subset with a common interest and to advocate on their behalf, that would preclude me from offering evidence or making arguments in the public interest if that differed in any way from the interests of that group. So that would really just stop the entire process. The second prohibition has to do with settlement. So as public intervener, I'm not allowed to agree to the settlement of a matter. And sometimes utilities get a little frustrated by this prohibition because sometimes the utilities case in front of the board is reasonable, wholly consistent with public interest objectives. My own independent expert evidence supports it. There really isn't anything to fight about. And in those cases, applicants would very much like to settle, forego the cost and time and resources of a hearing and save the ratepayers from having to pay for it. But they can't do that because the statute prohibits it. And that's important because at the end of the day, the board is required to make decisions in the public interest. And part of doing so is to have the argument about why a certain outcome is in the public interest sort of fleshed out in a public forum, demonstrated to the board, explained to the board, and supported by the evidence and connected back to those principles in a forum that is seen, not only where that's done, but seen to be done. So a settlement would circumvent that process and that goal. So that's all I really have to say, although I am happy to talk more about just and reasonable rates and the public interest if anyone has any questions about that in particular.
Yeah, we will definitely.
Other than that, I'll just
perfect.
Thank everyone for allowing me to be here. It's a nice treat to be able to chat outside the formality of a proceeding.
Super, thank you so much, Heather. So we do have some questions. If you stop sharing your screen, that's awesome. And I'll just let folks know that we've got about 6 minutes. If we run over a couple of minutes, I hope that's okay with everybody because I do want to ensure that we cover the questions that are here. By all means, don't hesitate to ask more. And once maybe I get through the chat ones, if folks just want to unmute and ask their question, by all means, go ahead. So the first one is, what is the relationship between the EUB and the utilities redecisions? Are they binding? I'm asking because my understanding is that less than a decade ago for the Point Lepreau nuclear generating station refurbishment, the EUB decided it was not in the public interest to refurbish the plant, but NB Power went ahead with it anyway. Can you please explain? Thank you. And that's from Susan O'Donnell. Who would like to take that one on?
Listen, I'll give it a shot, only because I've been around longer than some of the other people on this. So the legislation changed between the Lepreau decision and changed in 2013, I think. And as you know, there's some proposals again. But at that time, the requirement was for a recommendation that the board made a recommendation to the government, and then the government either accepted it or didn't. The current legislation requires projects over $50 million to be approved by the board. And so that is a change. So in the areas where the board has jurisdiction, and that's not that doesn't have wide jurisdiction, it has certain jurisdictions, the decisions are binding.
Okay, very helpful. Very helpful. This one from Jim. What are the parameters that determine public interest? I recently filed comments with the board which addressed public health concerns and also government policy on the topic of greenhouse gas emissions. These questions were not addressed by the board. Who would like to take that one on? Maybe there's more to that one. Hold on a sec here. Not just by the board or proponent at the hearing or by the board's decision. If I had been able to be an intervener, would I have been able to pursue those subjects? Thank you.
I can take that on generally. I certainly can't comment on what you would have been able to pursue if you had been an intervener. Obviously, you know, the board makes determinations as to what's relevant, et cetera, et cetera. I will say that one of the things generally that people run up against who intervene where their particular interest is based in general health concerns, general environmental concerns, is that the board is typically, this happens in rate applications, and rate applications are about approving a revenue requirement and setting just and reasonable rates. And the primary driver behind those proceedings is determining whether those rates are just and reasonable, meaning within any kind of statutory constraints on what that means, that they are rates that allow the utility to recover its prudently incurred costs and earn a fair return on its assets that are used in pursuit of their regulated activities. And that is a very longstanding principle with a whole bunch of offshoot law and principles that we don't have time to get into. But that is the basic principle. More generally, the board is primarily an economic regulator. And while it certainly takes all kinds of public interest issues into consideration, there is always the challenge of ensuring that arguments that may in some other context be very central to public interest arguments are a little less central to the primary decision being made by the board. And sometimes that can be perceived as the board not paying attention to those issues.
Listen, thank you so much for that. There's one more question here, and then I'll do one and we'll do the poll and close things off. So it is again around this public interest framework. Many of us obviously operate outside of just the strict economic regulator parameters. And this question is around, from Tom McLean, is the public interest framework, which is updated and used by the public intervener, a publicly accessible document? And then I have a question as well.
The answer to that is it's not a document at all.
Okay.
And it's not an actual thing. It is, when I say framework, I mean in the conceptual, analytical sense, that there is a body of law and a body of regulatory principles that guide the understanding of what is in the public interest in terms of energy regulation. And those principles, while they are numerous and they are tweaked all the time as time goes on, basically have to do with this bargain that I mentioned with just and reasonable rates, that there's a bargain between the utility and its customers, where the customers are supposed to get safe and reliable energy at a rate that's just and reasonable, and the utility is supposed to be able to cover its costs and earn a fair return. That's the bargain that is enforced by those principles. That is in the public interest because everybody needs safe and reliable service, and we don't want to pay any more than we have to for it. There are other principles that relate to fairness, not only between the utility and its customers, but fairness among customers, different classes of customers, and other stakeholders. So when I say public interest framework, I mean the 200 years of principles and legal framework that we understand, that we filter those facts through.
Okay. So thank you, everyone. We are just coming on 2 o'clock. If there was a burning question, I know I have one, but I'm reluctant to open it up. I think it's going to take a second call. And so by all means, if you have a burning question, you can unmute and ask it now. And if not, I'll do the final poll and thank our speakers for this session. But promise you, we'll have another on this very important topic, particularly around maybe the legislative changes and some of our issues around public interest. Any other questions? All right, while I have this new poll up, just trying to get a sense if people feel they got from the webinar what they needed. So just complete that as you can, please, as we're closing off the webinar. I want to thank Kathleen and Heather and Dave, who've been very responsive and available to us. I look forward to engaging with you further. Although I'm not sure I feel less nervous about the whole process from listening to you all. It's a bit, it is intimidating, I have to say. And I'm somebody who's used to being in front of the room, but I do find the whole process quite intimidating. So you've done an excellent job. People do feel they know more about how EUB decisions are made. We still have some work figuring out how to address barriers around the broader interests that we certainly are concerned about. But we definitely know more about how you define the public interest, even if we might think environment and other things have something to do with it. I want to thank everybody. I'm going to close the session now. And I look forward to speaking to you all again soon. Take care, everybody. Thank you.